This billionaire travels with his wife to the mountains of Alaska for a photo shoot. But in one of the coldest places on Earth, something was waiting eagerly for them. The story begins with Charles, a billionaire businessman whose many ventures were thriving and highly profitable. He had so much money that even if he stopped working, he could live comfortably for the rest of his life. But for now, Charles was heading to the Alaskan mountains with his wife Mickey, who was also a model. He wanted to do a photo shoot with her, something that would become a cherished memory in the future. Since Charles had plenty of money, he hired a full crew. The photographer, Bob, along with his assistants and a few others, boarded a plane with Charles and Mickey and flew straight to the snowy Alaskan peaks. Charles had booked a resort in a remote part of the mountains where they would all stay. After a long journey, they finally arrived at the resort. The owner welcomed them and explained some important rules, warning them that this wasn't a typical resort. He told Charles, Mickey, Bob, and the crew that the area was full of polar bears. If they ate anything, they must pack the leftovers properly and make sure the doors and windows were tightly locked, otherwise dangerous bears could attack. Hearing this made everyone nervous, but they knew that if they were careful, they'd be safe inside. Later, Charles, Mickey, and the rest of the crew went to their rooms. As darkness fell, the temperature outside dropped even lower. Everyone knew how harsh the Alaskan nights could be, so they bundled up in their warmest clothes. Around midnight, Charles couldn't sleep. He was also a bit hungry, so he decided to head to the kitchen. The place was dark, so he carried a lantern to see his way. When he reached the kitchen area, he noticed a piece of meat lying open on the counter and the door wide open. At that moment, he remembered what the owner had said, that there were many bears in the area who could smell exposed food from far away and come straight for it. As Charles nervously tried to close the door, a massive bear suddenly appeared right in front of him. The creature was enormous and terrifying. It lunged at Charles, knocking him backward. He stumbled and tried to steady himself, but before anything worse could happen, it was revealed that it wasn't actually a bear at all. It was his crew members wearing a bear costume to scare him. The whole prank had been planned by his wife, Mickey, because it was Charles's birthday, and they wanted to surprise him in a fun way. Everyone gathered around and began preparing for the celebration. Although Charles had been terrified for a moment, he soon relaxed and laughed when he realized how much effort they'd put into his birthday. The group celebrated together and had a great time. Later, Mickey apologized for scaring him and gave him a small wristwatch as a gift, while one of his assistants handed him a knife with an inscription on it. Charles brushed it off, thinking, when would I ever need a knife anyway? Everything seemed perfect, and after the celebration, they all went to bed since they had to wake up early the next morning for the photo shoot in freezing weather. The next day, Mickey was doing a solo shoot while photographer Bob directed her to pose in different ways to get the best shots. But even during the session, Bob started flirting with Mickey. Charles, watching from a distance, didn't like it one bit. He hated seeing anyone get too close to his wife. So when Mickey's solo shots were done, Bob mentioned that the next part of the shoot would require a male partner for her. Charles immediately said that he would do it himself since Mickey was his wife and they were there to enjoy the experience together. But Bob refused, insisting that Mickey's male partner should be someone young and handsome, not an older man like Charles. Charles didn't react outwardly, but he wasn't surprised either. He already knew what kind of person Bob was. They had been friends since college, but Bob had always resented him. Charles had become a successful businessman, while Bob remained just an ordinary photographer, and deep down, that jealousy had never gone away. Obviously, Bob was trying every possible way to make Charles feel humiliated. Now he needed a male model to pair with Mickey for the photo shoot, meaning that even though Charles had paid for the entire trip, he wasn't allowed to be in the photos with his own wife. From the very start, things were going unfairly for Charles, and it was becoming clear that something was going on between Bob and Mickey. Who knew how close they might get, or what they might plan against Charles? Then suddenly, Bob's eyes fell on a framed picture of a man wearing a rugged costume. The moment Bob saw him, he knew, this was the perfect guy to model with Mickey. Excited, Bob took the photo to the resort owner and asked where he could find that man, saying he was perfect for his shoot. The owner laughed and said finding him wouldn't be easy. He explained that the man in the picture was a hunter named Kevin who had been living in the Alaskan mountains for years. The owner provided all the information about Kevin's last known location. Bob and his crew decided to go find him and ask him to join their shoot. Charles, wanting to explore Alaska a bit more himself, told Bob he would come along. Bob couldn't refuse, so they all got ready, boarded the plane, and took off toward the location where the hunter was said to be. From high above, the endless snow-covered peaks of Alaska stretched out below them, beautiful but dangerous. None of them realized how close they were flying toward real danger. Following the map the resort owner had given them, they eventually reached the area where the hunter was supposed to live. There were signs of human activity, tools, supplies, and an old cabin, but the hunter himself wasn't there. Instead, they found a note he had left behind, saying he had moved temporarily and included directions to his new location. After a brief discussion, Bob and Charles decided to continue their journey and follow the trail. Their plane was fueled up and ready, enough to cover the entire region if needed. So, without wasting time, they got back in the plane and headed off toward their next destination. The cold was growing worse by the minute, and it was only going to get harsher. But the real danger was just about to begin. As their plane flew through the icy sky, a flock of birds suddenly collided with it. The impact was so violent that the plane lost control, its engine failing before it began plummeting straight toward the water. The crash was devastating, the pilot died instantly, and the aircraft was completely destroyed. The survivors, Charles, Bob, and one of Bob's assistants, managed to escape and swim toward the shore. The water was so freezing that staying in it for even a few minutes could be fatal. Shivering and exhausted, the three men dragged themselves onto the icy ground and tried to figure out what to do next. They were stranded far from civilization, with no plane and no way back to the resort. The cold was unbearable, but luckily, they found a small matchbox among their supplies. Using it, they managed to start a small fire, the only thing keeping them from freezing to death. Sitting close to the flames, they waited and hoped someone would come to rescue them. But the area was completely isolated, there was no one around, only wild animals. After waiting for hours, Charles suggested that they should try to find the hunter. Maybe he could help them, or at least provide shelter and resources until they could return to the resort. Bob and his assistant agreed, and the three of them decided to head toward the hunter's last known location on foot. None of them knew what kind of dangers the forest ahead held for them. After walking for a while through the dense, snow-covered woods, they suddenly heard a strange sound. Looking ahead, they froze. It wasn't just any animal. A massive, terrifying brown bear was moving toward them. The beast had spotted them and was clearly preparing to attack. Terrified, Charles, Bob, and the assistant began running for their lives. They knew that if the bear caught them, it would tear them apart in seconds. But how could they possibly escape? Brown bears are far more dangerous than most other species, and when one comes after you, there's no time to hesitate. There are only a few survival tricks. If you have fire, hold out a burning stick. Wild animals, no matter how ferocious, are afraid of flames. If that fails, climb to higher ground, up a tree or onto a large rock. And if nothing else works, the most famous last resort is to play dead. Lie still, don't move, don't react, and hope the bear loses interest and leaves. But in their panic, Charles, Bob, and the assistant couldn't think straight. They ran in the wrong direction and got completely lost, with the bear still chasing close behind. Soon, they came to a deep waterfall, a sheer drop with icy water crashing below. If they jumped, survival was unlikely, but behind them, the bear was closing in fast. Bob and his assistant were terrified, but Charles stayed calm, thinking fast about what to do next. Charles had seen plenty of survival movies before, so he quickly started thinking strategically. He broke a nearby tree and pushed it down across the gap, creating a makeshift bridge they could use to cross to the other side. He told Bob and his assistant to go first, and they carefully made their way across. Charles was the last one left. Just then, the bear reached the spot and began approaching fast. When Charles was halfway across the bridge, the bear grabbed the fallen tree and started shaking it violently. Charles lost his balance and slipped, clinging to his backpack as he dangled helplessly over the drop. Inside the bag were a few supplies and several flare guns he could use to signal for help or make contact with someone. But before he could do anything, he lost his grip and fell into the freezing water below, hitting the surface hard and injuring himself in several places. Luckily, Bob and his assistant managed to grab hold of him before he went over the waterfall and pulled him safely to the shore. The bear remained above for a while, pacing back and forth, and then disappeared into the forest. Exhausted and freezing, the three men tried to warm themselves and regain their strength. They decided to keep moving toward the direction where the hunter was supposed to be. But after walking for hours, something felt wrong. No matter how far they went, they weren't reaching the location. It seemed as if they were going in circles, passing the same trees and landmarks they'd already seen. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. They had almost no food or supplies left. The next morning, Charles took out the knife he'd received as a birthday gift. Using it, he gathered branches and leaves to make a fire. Later, he handed the knife to Bob's assistant and told him to tie it to a stick and try catching some fish from the nearby river. The assistant understood and went to the riverbank. Charles and Bob stayed near the fire to keep it going. But moments later, they heard the assistant screaming in pain. Both men rushed toward the sound and found that the assistant had accidentally stabbed his own leg while fishing. The wound was deep and bleeding badly. Charles immediately began tending to him, cleaning and bandaging the injury as best he could. When he was done, he firmly told Bob to either burn the blood-soaked cloth or bury it deep in the ground, otherwise, the smell of blood could attract bears. Night fell again, and Charles managed to build a small shelter for them to rest in. The assistant couldn't walk anymore, so they decided to stay there until morning. The three sat by the fire, trying to stay warm. But as Charles looked around, his eyes caught sight of the same blood-stained cloth lying nearby. Bob hadn't burned it or buried it, just left it there carelessly. A chill went down Charles's spine. Something felt wrong. He got up to take care of it himself. But just as he reached for the cloth, a massive bear emerged from the darkness. Before they could react, the bear lunged forward, grabbing the injured assistant and dragging him into the woods. Charles froze in terror as the horrifying sounds of growls and screams echoed through the night. Charles grabbed a burning branch and tried to scare the bear away, but the animal was huge and began roaring so loudly that Bob froze in fear. Bob dragged Charles back, knowing they probably couldn't save the assistant now. The bear killed the assistant and began eating him. Charles was devastated but powerless to help. Charles and Bob fled up into the mountain ranges, now only the two of them left to survive in that freezing wilderness with virtually no food or supplies. The next morning snow began to fall, making everything worse, but Charles refused to sit idle. He built a small trap, something he'd seen in survival movies, and eventually managed to catch a small animal they could eat to restore some energy. Shortly after, they heard the sound of a helicopter passing overhead, so they tried desperately to attract it, but it was flying too high and the forest canopy hid them from view. By the time they reached an open area, the chopper was already gone. Frustrated, Bob blamed Charles for everything, openly confessing his jealousy over Charles's success and money. Although the tension flared, Charles kept his cool and focused on survival. With food scarce and a dangerous bear possibly hunting them, Charles used the knife he had been given and fashioned a tool tied to a stick. He instructed Bob to catch fish while he waited. Suddenly they heard footsteps. The bear had found them again, so they sprinted into the forest and spent a terrified night, surrounding themselves with a ring of fire to deter an attack. The next morning Charles told Bob bluntly that if they were to move forward the bear would have to be killed. Bob recoiled at the idea, but Charles, confident and determined, prepared his sharp knife, tied to a wooden shaft, and hung a blood-stained cloth as bait. Charles used the blood-stained cloth to lure the bear closer so he could kill it with his sharpened weapon. Seeing Charles's confidence, Bob couldn't back down and joined him. Both armed themselves and faced the monstrous bear head-on. The bear immediately charged, and their weapons barely made a dent. In the chaos, the bear struck Charles, hurling him down into a ravine and injuring him. Bob tried to help, but the bear lunged at him, wounding him badly. To save his friend, Charles shouted to draw the bear's attention. As the beast turned toward him and attacked, Charles thrust his spear with all his strength, driving it straight through the bear's body. The massive creature collapsed and died on the spot. Exhausted and starving, Charles and Bob built a fire, cooked the bear's meat, and wrapped themselves in its fur for warmth against the worsening cold. Wearing the bear's thick hide gave them enough protection to keep moving forward. Their next goal was to find the hunter and somehow make it home, but they were completely disoriented, unsure which direction to take. That's when Charles remembered the pocket watch his wife had given him. Opening it, he improvised a makeshift compass, placing a small iron needle on a leaf floating in water. To magnetize it, he rubbed one end of the needle repeatedly so its particles aligned with Earth's magnetic field. Once placed on the leaf, the rubbed end slowly rotated to point north, helping them determine their direction. He even mentioned another trick, using strands of dry hair rubbed against the needle to achieve the same effect. Thanks to this, Charles finally figured out which way to go. The two men pressed on until they spotted a small cabin ahead. Finding no one there, they went inside to investigate. The place was abandoned, though Bob quickly found a bottle of alcohol and began drinking while Charles discovered a map showing their resort's location and the route back. They even found a boat nearby that could help them travel downstream. As Charles prepared to leave, he noticed a wooden box, the same one that had contained his knife. Inside it was a bill of purchase listing both the knife and the pocket watch. To his shock, it revealed that his wife hadn't bought those gifts for him, but for Bob. It became clear that Bob and Charles's wife were having an affair. The betrayal was too much for Charles to process. When Bob came inside the cabin, Charles confronted him about the truth. Completely drunk, Bob admitted it bluntly: Charles's wife never really loved him. She was only with him for his money, and if he didn't have it, she would have never stayed. The words hit Charles hard, filling him with anger, but before he could react, Bob pointed a gun at him. Slurring his words, Bob threatened to kill Charles, confessing that he'd always been jealous of his success. He said he planned to kill him, marry his wife, and take over all his wealth. Despite the danger, Charles remained calm, knowing Bob was drunk and unpredictable. Bob kept shouting, waving the gun, while Charles slowly began to back away, pretending to surrender. Secretly, Charles was leading Bob toward a trap he had set earlier, a hidden pit covered with branches. When they reached it, Charles stepped aside at the last second, and Bob fell straight into it. Sharp wooden stakes pierced his body, leaving him badly wounded and screaming in pain. If Charles left him there, Bob would die either from the injuries or by being eaten by the bear. But Charles couldn't abandon him, no matter what he'd done. Bob was still his friend. Summoning all his strength, Charles climbed down and pulled Bob out of the pit. For the first time, Bob felt the weight of his guilt. Even after trying to kill him, Charles had saved his life. Charles helped him onto a small boat they'd found earlier, and they began drifting down the river toward safety. Bob, bleeding and weak, looked at Charles and confessed that he had been a terrible friend, jealous, bitter, and desperate to have the same success. He admitted that he'd never been able to achieve what Charles had and feared that now their friendship was over forever. But Charles quietly told him to stop talking and focus on surviving. "You're my best friend," he said. "I forgave you a long time ago." After hours of drifting, they finally reached the shore. Charles built a small fire to keep Bob warm, as his body was too injured to move. Bob struggled to breathe but managed to whisper an apology, knowing this might be the last time he ever spoke to his friend. Bob confessed everything. He admitted that Charles's wife had never made the first move. It was he who had manipulated her and pulled her into his trap of affection. Hearing this, Charles stayed silent for a moment. After everything that had happened, and after Bob's repeated apologies, Charles finally said he forgave them both, Bob and his wife. The two men sat talking quietly until the faint sound of a helicopter echoed in the distance. It was the rescue team flying nearby. They were finally out of the forest, standing in an open area, which meant they had a real chance of being seen. Charles tried shouting, but his voice was too weak to reach them. Realizing this might be their only chance to survive, he quickly threw some wet leaves over the small fire. Thick smoke began rising into the air, forming a visible signal. From a distance, the rescue team spotted it and immediately steered the helicopter toward them. Charles felt a wave of relief. Help was finally coming. Excited, he rushed over to tell Bob the good news, but when he reached him, it was too late. Bob had already taken his last breath. Heartbroken, Charles carried his friend's body to the rescue team, who helped him return safely to the resort. When they arrived, police officers and media reporters were already there, covering the entire incident. Everyone now knew what had happened in the wilderness. Charles's wife, Mickey, stood waiting, visibly tense and anxious. As Charles approached her, his face showed exhaustion and deep sadness. Without saying a word, he placed a watch in her hand, the same watch that once belonged to Bob. Mickey immediately understood that Charles knew the truth about her affair. Whether he would forgive her or not was entirely up to him. But Charles had gone through something that had changed him forever. When the reporters asked him how the others died, he calmly told them everything. His survival story soon became famous, but deep down, he knew that no amount of money or fame could bring back his lost friend. Bob was gone, and life had taught Charles one painful truth: money can't buy life or loyalty. And with that, our story comes to an end.